Greetings. Welcome to a discussion of reading the Bible through 6 lenses. Today we are going to discuss the lens of niche marketing. This lens helps the reader to understand why there are differences between biblical books and while there are differences between biblical texts within the same book or biblical teachings, why there's difference between different books. Now let us begin with a definition of niche marketing. Niche marketing targets a particular issue, particular need, and/or a particular group. There is a communication question that raises who the target is. In communicating with the target, is the target a very wide and diverse, a whole group of people, or is the target very narrow and very small? A single, maybe one or two individuals, a single group, a single interest. In archery, the target is the center where the archer tries to hit the center with an arrow. And the archer really doesn't care about the rest of the target area as long as the archer hits the target. Well, the same with niche marketing. It really doesn't care with a very large group of people. Niche marketing tries to hit a very small group of people with the issues that are facing them and the language they understand. And so as we look at this discussion, we're going to be talking about trying to hit a very particular target by the biblical writers. I should add that in this discussion we're going to primarily talk about the New Testament. And the reason is the New Testament was written over a time period of 50 to 70 years. In contrast, the Old Testament was written somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years. Therefore, it is much easier to illustrate niche marketing in the New Testament than it is in the Old Testament. Now, as we look at the New Testament, we're going to look at the 4 gospel accounts, and we're going to also discuss some of Paul's letters. So let's begin. The New Testament begins with the gospel according to St. Matthew, which is written to a congregation that is diverse. Its membership is Jewish and Gentile. In modern day times, when we talk about diversity of churches, we usually say a church is diverse when 20% of its membership is not the same as the majority of its membership. In other words, in Matthew's congregation, using that rule, at least 20% of the church must be Jewish, or at least 20% of the church must be Gentile. The scholars debate the numbers. I think it's more 50-50. And so when Matthew writes his gospel account, he's writing to a congregation that has different backgrounds, different religious experiences, different values, attitudes, and lifestyles. The Jewish group within that congregation, or at least part of the Jewish group in that congregation, is worried that if Gentiles are welcomed into the church and become equal members, it will not be long until the church loses its Jewish roots. And they're asking, if we get too many Gentiles in this church, above 20%, what happens to Passover? What happens to the laws of Moses? What happens to a kosher house? The Gentiles are asking similar questions. If we join this Jewish congregation or these Jews within our congregation, what happens to our values, attitudes, and lifestyles? The way we marked holidays, the food that we are allowed or permitted to eat, the way we were taught to worship. Now, Matthew has to address both of these groups in his gospel account, and this is how he does it. Matthew begins his gospel account with Jesus' genealogy in chapter 1. And it's interesting to note that in that genealogy, there are 4 Gentiles. And these 4 Gentiles are a part of Jesus' heritage. And if Gentiles can be part of Jesus' heritage, they certainly can be part of his church. It's also interesting to note that those 4 Gentiles happen to be all women, which says something about the role that women play not only in Jesus' life, but in the life of the church. Matthew goes on and he quotes a large number of Old Testament texts, and he quotes often that Jesus is doing things to fulfill the words of the prophets. Then he goes on and says, but Jesus says when he cures the centurion's son, the centurion has more faith than all of those in the house of Israel. And when he cures the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, she has more faith than all of the house of Israel. We're getting the message, both Jews and Gentiles belong. And then Matthew ends his gospel account with the Great Commission. And the last 2 verses of the account is that Jesus' disciples are to go into all the world, teaching everything that Jesus taught and commanded, and then they are to baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Ghost. The church, Jesus, is for all. Now think about that as the 21st century church struggles with diversity and who can belong. And what can we learn from the gospel according to St. Matthew about diversity? The second gospel account in the New Testament is Mark. And Mark was written to a congregation who experienced persecution. Nero, the emperor of the Roman Empire in 64, persecuted the Christians. Now, those who survive persecution are those who run away, or those who hide, those who keep their head down low so they will not be recognized by their neighbors, to escape being arrested by the authority. This is especially true of leaders, because in persecution you go immediately after leaders. Arrest them and execute them. Now, as Mark is writing to this congregation, he's writing to those who certainly are not poster children of the faith. And so Mark begins his gospel account by describing the disciples as being very faithful people in the very beginning. And they begin to follow Jesus. They're like the Roman Christians before the persecution of Nero. And then throughout the gospel account, they become less understanding. They don't perceive who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing, no matter how much they have heard Jesus' teachings and seen his miracles. The disciples are very much like those who belong to the congregation. They are not poster children of the faith. And then, in the 16th chapter, the last chapter in the Gospel according to Mark, the angel says to the women who come to the tomb, "Tell the disciples I will meet them in Galilee." Remember, we're in Jerusalem now. And this is an invitation to the disciples that they can come and be with Jesus, they can be restored, they can be forgiven, and they can be loved. The Gospel according to Mark could very well address those who have dropped out of the church today for a long period of time, but the invitation is always there, as it is in chapter 16. You can come back. You can be loved. You can be forgiven. There is this ending of hope. Next is the Gospel according to Luke, and it is written to a Gentile congregation. In the Roman world in the first century, politicians who retired, for example, Pilate, or military personnel from officers down to enlisted persons, when they retired, they were given a farm in occupied territory. It's where the saying comes, he or she bought the farm. I did my duty, I got paid off, my retirement is a farm. The Romans did this to prevent uprisings in any of the occupied territory. For throughout the occupied territories were all of these Roman citizens, these Roman soldiers, that if anything happened, there was a force on the land. Now, how do you write a gospel account to largely Roman citizens and Greeks who are not part of the Jewish faith and have the background of the Bible and of tradition? Well, one way that Luke does this is he writes his gospel account making sure that Gentiles and non-Jews are the heroes. Think of the prodigal son. And also think of the Good Samaritan. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, a man is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He falls among robbers, he is beaten. A priest comes down the same road. Now, priest, very good person. Probably somebody we would like as our neighbor. Sees the beaten man, passes by on the other side. A Levite comes down. Again, a very good person, probably somebody we would want for our neighbor. Passes by on the other side. The Jews hated Gentiles. A Gentile comes down the road, sees the man beaten, and then stops and helps him. To even make it more spectacular, Samaritans are hated more than the common Gentile. The hero is a Gentile, and even the most despised of Gentiles. Think about how Luke could affect thinking about reaching those outside of our church, to those who have never believed, and to those that too often the church has dismissed as not worthy. The target audience is Gentiles. The Gospel of John was written probably to a congregation in Ephesus where mysticism and wisdom was highly valued. Many believe that Ephesus was the second most important city in the Roman Empire, second only to Rome. It was the center of emperor worship. It was an intellectual hub. And so when John writes, he's not writing to ex-military and to ex-politicians. He's not writing to a mixed congregation. He's writing to those who really value mysticism, who really value wisdom. And so he has to connect with those people. In his introduction, in the prologue to his gospel account, he says that when the world was made, Jesus was with God. Nothing was made without Jesus being there. By the way, that's Proverbs chapter 8. And what John is trying to do is to speak the language, the idiom of Ephesians. He's trying to relate to the people he wants to read his gospel. And then throughout the gospel account, John uses symbolism more than any other biblical writer. Commentaries on John are usually very thick. But in niche marketing, you've got to speak to your audience. And so this is a wonderful book, or all four gospel accounts are wonderful books to say, pick your audience carefully and then niche market to each of them according to their need, according to their language and idiom, according to who they are. Now, let's turn to the epistles of the New Testament. And we're going to begin with Romans. But before we do that, I'm going to say to you, we're going to only choose 7 of Paul's letters. In the Bible, there are 13. All scholars believe Paul wrote 7 of them. Scholarship is mixed on whether the other 6 were written by Paul or a disciple of Paul. So we're just going to look at the 7 undisputed letters of Paul. And the first is Romans. Now, Romans was written to a congregation that had never met Paul. Paul did not start this congregation. And so Paul is writing this letter first and foremost to introduce himself to the Romans. Of course, they know him by reputation. They know his teachings by reputation. And many times what Paul has said and done has been challenged by others. So Paul is writing and saying, listen, this is who I am, and this is what I believe. It's a letter of introduction. It has 3 purposes for being written. In the very end of Romans, Paul says he wants to go to Spain. Paul has a passion for starting new congregations. And to get to Spain, he wants to pass through Rome. And I strongly suspect he's going to ask them for mission support. Help pay for my trip. Scholars believe, or at least some scholars believe, that Romans is Paul's first attempt at a systematic theology. Not going to ramble in a personal letter, not going to just bump from topic to topic, but Paul is going to share in a precise line what he thinks on some topics. It is by far the most scholarly of all the epistles. And others believe that Paul is trying to clarify what he said in the book or letter of Galatians. Galatians was written 4 or 5 years before Romans was written. And Galatians had been debated. It is the Magna Carta of Christian freedom. It's the Magna Carta of God's grace. And it's been debated, what does that mean? And so Paul is very hard trying to clarify what he has said. And so he writes this letter. And I believe all of those points can be meshed together. He writes this letter to introduce himself. He writes this letter to get some aid to go to Spain. He writes this letter to explain his thinking more clearly than in Galatians. And he writes this letter as a systematic theology. And when I read Romans, I read it with that in mind. This is a precise, well thought out letter to a congregation in Rome. 1 Corinthians was written to a congregation filled with dissidents. The congregation is fighting like mad. In the first chapter, we're told there are 4 groups within that congregation. Many scholars believe there are 4 house churches in Corinth. There's the house church of Paul, there's the house church of Cephas, there's the house church of Apollos, and there's the house church of Christ. And they're arguing about who has the best, the most important spiritual gifts. They're arguing about the resurrection. There are various ways to celebrate communion. And now, how do you address a congregation full of conflict? I see Paul here as a consultant in conflict management. And so Paul addresses those issues. He addresses the issue of spiritual gifts in chapter 12. He especially stresses communion in chapter 11. He addresses the conflict in chapters 1 through 4. And then in chapter 13, he comes through with, if we are going to solve these conflicts, we have to do it with love. I smile because this is the wedding text in the 21st century Common Era. But it is a text of conflict management in the first century. When we read 1 Corinthians, we're reading about conflict and how to deal with conflict and what Paul thinks about conflict. 2 Corinthians was written in defense of Paul's teachings and ministry. Paul has been attacked, and he has to defend himself. Scholars believe that this letter may be really 4 individual letters written in a very short time between each other, and the letters are the conflict, there's a resolution, conflict, there's a resolution, and we go back and forth in the thinking, and the moods change just radically throughout the letter. But at least in Paul's response to being attacked, it's very clear this is a very, very contentious letter. And in Paul's defense, he pulls out his experiences and his background and his credentials. Sometimes they come across as bragging of, look at me, how great I am. They're not bragging. They're defenses. Protecting Paul from who he is and protecting what he has taught. And when we read 2 Corinthians, that becomes the lens, the background through which we read this letter. Galatians is written to a whole province. If Paul was writing today to churches in Ohio, he would write to the churches of Ohio. Well, that's what he's writing, to the churches of Galatia, this big mass of territory. And Paul is here, and Galatians take care of him. He has a medical problem, and in the process, he preaches the gospel, and they are converted. And the gospel that Paul preaches is that we are saved by grace and grace alone. Galatians is often referred to as the Magna Carta of Christian freedom through grace. You don't have to do anything. God does all the work. Our sole responsibility is to respond what God has already done. Paul leaves Galatia. False teachers, we call them Judaizers, come and say, yes, there is God's grace, but you also must become Jews first before you can be a Christian. Therefore, you must be circumcised. And probably, therefore, you have to have a kosher house. And some of the Galatians believe the Judaizers and turn from Paul's argument that we are saved by grace and grace alone. And Paul is livid. He has been challenged, his ministry questioned, his teachings denounced. And so he writes a very angry letter back. He doesn't even say greetings and a hello to the congregation. He gets right into it with all the fury and the might of an angry, hurt man. But then something happens from the beginning of that letter and his argument about it is grace and grace alone, till we get to the end of the letter, and Paul says to those who were loyal to Paul and loyal to Paul's teachings, when your fellow Christians want to come back from giving up what the true gospel is, welcome them with all gentleness. With all gentleness. Reminds us of the father welcoming back his son in the parable of the prodigal son. Disagreements, fighting, anger can end with welcoming back with all gentleness. It is a letter for the church to a very specific problem. 1 Thessalonians was written to a congregation that had just experienced persecution. Paul comes to Thessalonica. Paul is driven from Thessalonica by angry mobs. The church is under persecution. Paul worries about the church. He sends a representative to find out. He has just heard that the church has survived the persecution and they're doing well. And so Paul writes this letter to say, I thank you survived the crisis that was threatening your existence. And then he deals with the issue of resurrection of the dead, because certainly in persecution, Christians have died. We read this letter as a letter of gratitude and thanksgiving, and one to remind us that no matter what happens in life, there is the resurrection of the dead. The letter to the Philippians was written to a friendly congregation, one that Paul calls partners in ministry. From what we know from the letters of Paul, this is the only congregation that has continually supported his ministry with gifts. We assume the gifts were monetary. And so Paul has always had this kind of special, intimate kind of relationship with Philippi, the congregation in Philippi. And he writes to them about his feelings. He writes from prison. He says, I'm tired, and today's language, he's burnt out. He really would like to be with the Lord in heaven. But if God keeps him here, he's going to stay and continue to work to spread the gospel. And so we read this letter as a friendly letter between a corporate colleague and an individual colleague who work together to bring about the gospel of Jesus Christ in this world. Philemon is a very friendly letter as well. It's the short letter. It's one page. Philemon is a co-worker in the Lord with Paul. He is wealthy. He owns slaves. One of the slaves has run away. Now, runaway slaves, when they're caught, they're brought back to their masters. They are severely punished. They may even be put to death. But somehow this slave named Onesimus meets up with Paul and becomes a co-worker with Paul. So Paul is writing a fellow co-worker saying, let Onesimus go. Let him be free. Let him continue to travel and to work with me. Now, we don't know whether Philemon does what Paul asked, but we do know that at the end of the first century, there was a bishop by the name of Onesimus, and scholars wonder if it's the same person. Now, to sum all of this up, reading the Bible as niche marketing helps us to understand the uniqueness of each book and text. Antioch for Matthew is radically different than the middle of modern-day Turkey for Luke, and radically different than the persecuted congregation in Rome, and radically different. And we see that difference and the issues addressed when we read the Bible through niche marketing. And we also see the differences in the 7 undisputed letters of Paul in the type of issues being faced, practical and theological, and how those letters were written precisely to hit the center of the target and not for all of the other congregations that happened to exist at that time. And then I want to say it also helps us to understand why there are apparent differences between texts. I am caught that in the Gospel according to St. Mark, Jesus says, "Those who are not against me are for me." But in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, Jesus says, "Those who are not for me are against me." Those two statements are the exact opposite. Why? Niche marketing. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for sharing in this discussion through your watching of this video. I hope it has been very helpful to you.